Hello, everybody. Welcome to WOTS Weekly Features. Today's guest is Matthew Blackett from Spacing. We'll be chatting about Matthew's book, Packaged Toronto, and the ways that package design holds little moments of history. I'm Yali, and I'll be your host. WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Peytoon First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabe and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land that you live on, wherever you're tuning in from. So today's guest is Matthew Blackett. He is the publisher, creative director, and one of the founders of Spacing. He is also a graphic artist, product designer, and deeply committed advocate for Toronto. Blackett was named Editor of the Year for 2007 by the Canadian Society of Magazine Editors, and Spacing was named Canadian Small Magazine of the Year in 2007, 2008, and 2009. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. It's so nice to have you. Spacing was named Canadian Small Magazine of the Year in 2007, 2008, and 2009. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. It's so nice to have you.
Hi there. I'm getting a really bad echo of about like 10-second delay, so I'm hearing your voice twice.
Okay. Maybe I will mute myself while you speak, and hopefully that'll help it a little bit. Okay. Maybe I will mute myself while you speak, and hopefully that'll help it a little bit.
That seems to be a lot better there.
Here, let's get into the first question. Can you start off by maybe telling us about the inspiration behind Packaged Toronto and what drew you to that project? Let's get into the first question.
Sure.
Start off by maybe telling us about the inspiration behind.
I apologize. I'm still hearing you ask this question again. So, and I can hear myself about 10 seconds delayed, so I'm having a little...
No worries.
I think Maya is looking into this.
Yes, Maya is looking into it. Once you get started chatting, I'll maybe unplug my headphones and play around with my settings as well. Yes, Maya is looking into it. Once you get started chatting, I'll maybe unplug my headphones and play around with my settings as well. Okay, let's see. In the meantime, would you mind telling us about your thoughts, your inspiration, what you wanted to achieve with that project of Packaged Toronto?
Sure.
Your thoughts.
So can you hear me fine? Okay, I've turned down the volume, so I can't hear you at all. It makes it a little bit easier for me to speak at the moment. The genesis of Packaged Toronto is with Spacing. We've been doing books for a number of years, and we decided that we wanted to do something that was a little bit like photography, that was photography based. And in this case, we created a series. We started off with my photography book on the beautiful mess of Toronto laneways, and then moved on to a book called Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto, which is about architecture. And then this is our third book in the series called Packaged Toronto. And it's about the packaging of items from the city's history, basically starting in around 1870 to 1950 is the packaging that we look at. And this packaging of products comes from the City of Toronto's archives and museum collection. It gives us a real idea of what our everyday life was during this time. And a lot of these items are obsolete, technology is advanced, but the packaging is pretty simple, and but also evocative of the era that they're in. And over those 70 years that this book kind of covers, 70 or 80 years that this book covers, you see the emergence of a unique design that's related to Toronto and Canada. Toronto being, the manufacturing center kind of the country, thus allowing, in some ways, the aesthetic that Toronto built up through Eaton's and a number CCM and a number of companies was the aesthetic that Canada adopted. So Canada right now, we're kind of going through a moment where, in the world of graphic design, where there's a great appreciation for design from the post-World War II era. It's very modern, and it was something that has come to represent Canadian design now. But in order to arrive there, you have to come from someplace else, and that's what our book does. It shows us where the modern Canadian design aesthetic emerged from.
All right, excellent. Could you talk a little bit more about the use of these package designs as like a vessel themselves for history and for moments? I thought that it was really interesting when I was reading through, because I think I mentioned this to you before. I had just never considered the fact that a package design could be a historical artifact until I got my hands on your book. So could you speak a little bit more to that idea specifically?
Mm-hmm. So I find it really interesting to. So I've done a book. I've done a number of books previous to these, and one was called 50 Objects That Define Toronto, and it was kind of a similar in approach where I scoured the city of Toronto's archives and museum collection to find things that represent the city, and I really do love trying to tell stories through objects and products. So it's for the same reason that all of us keep memory boxes and those types of things. We it may be a ticket to a concert is the only thing that we have from that concert, but it tells it reminds us of a story. It reminds us of that evening or that experience or who you went with. And I think that's no different for the packages that we're focusing on in this book. Is that they're very evocative. You see these things, you think about the people of the time and what they were doing and how they were living. So we have like homeopathic potions that are diuretics, but they're packaged really beautiful. But they solve everything from hysteria among women. That would I don't believe that, but that's actually what was quoted on the side of the packaging. To the shakes, to anxiety, to allowing you to concentrate better. There were all these kind of like magic kind of potions basically, and so it's really kind of neat to think about those because we're actually going through a time now too where we're homeopathic medicine is very very popular at the time, and we're going through awakening of wellness and that type of stuff in our society, and so that was something that was happening back in over a century ago. So I find it really interesting and charming to look at some of these packages, and then as a graphic designer too, it also it allows me to explore some of the design concepts and ideas. Some of them were imported from Europe, some of them were from America, and some of them we created ourselves. So that it was important for me to kind of use these objects as a starting point to tell histories about CCM and about ginger ale, which was invented here in Toronto, or pablum, which was again invented at the city's the Sick Kids Hospital and marketed. So like Toronto has a very kind of interesting and progressive history when it comes to making stuff. So that's one of the reasons why I love doing this book.
No, it's interesting that you mentioned the ginger ale because I actually didn't know that ginger ale was invented in Toronto. I know obviously Canada's ginger ale, but that was a cool little tidbit that I found out. So could you tell us a little bit about what the research process was like behind these artifacts and images once you kind of got your hands on the thing that you wanted to include in the book? How did you go about writing the story behind it?
Yeah, so part of it is I'm very fortunate to have a very excellent working relationship with the people at the City of Toronto's um, uh, museum collection and archives, and so they give me a lot of access, and so there's a database, and so I go through this database, but I go through those database, I find things, I get onto the shelves, and I'm like, oh, look at this cool thing, look at this cool thing. So I did I this is kind of a unique project in terms, generally like an author of a book, writes the book, submits the manuscript to the editor. The editor fixes it up and gives it to the designer, and then it comes together. I play all of those roles in this book, in many ways, and so we had a lot of contributors to this book. But I designed this book. I did the photography first. I took a lot of photographs, and then I started to develop the stories that I wanted to kind of go with it. And so I was doing the layout at the same time before I was even developing any of the stories. And so I would often develop a story would come about because I had a photograph and I did a layout. I'm like, we need to do this, which is not often the case. So it was a very kind of organic process of creating the book. I don't want to say page by page, but like I did a fair amount of that kind of work, which is not the typical kind of process to making a book. I went back to the archives and the museum collection a number of times to find stuff and to photograph stuff. And it's a very kind of unique process. And so I was also able to work hand in hand with two people, Alex and Wayne, who are also the co-authors of this book, and they are both City of Toronto Museum employees. Wayne had just recently retired. He was the chief curator, and Alex is also one of their head curators. And so both of them worked really well with me, and they did a lot of writing as well in research. But yeah, it's kind of a unique process compared to what other books are like.
Definitely. I thought that it was particularly interesting how you mentioned that you're a writer, but you're also a graphic designer. And you've
Mm-hmm.
already touched on this a little bit, but how did it feel to be able to step into both of those roles fully that you love to do and be able to put them together to come up with this project specifically?
So um, it's so the creative process is. So I look at it's kind of hard to explain. So partly is when I do a book, I want to fill a gap in the market of books about Toronto. So spacing, for audience members or people watching this that don't know, we're a magazine that comes out 4 times a year. We publish 2 books a year, but we also have a retail store in downtown Toronto at Queen and Spadina on Richmond Avenue. And so a big part of what we do is we sell lots of books about the city that aren't ours. We haven't published. And so I have a real good idea. I think we have the preeminent collection of books about Toronto of any retail store in the city or the country, I guess in the world then. But in doing so, I have a really good idea of what is actually out there in the market in terms of being published about the city. And, sometimes I'm like, oh, I really wish there was a book about X, Y, and Z about the city. So when it comes time for us to start doing some of our work, that's partly how I determine is like, where are the holes and what do people want to know about? And what are some of the things that we haven't covered in terms of a topic? So design and graphic design hadn't been anything we really covered much of in our magazine and stuff we did. And it was something of a real personal interest. And then also because I have this strong relationship with the city's museum collection, I was able to kind of combine a couple of these things. So that was partly why we've done this book. And what I've been able to see is that people are really are really charmed by looking at old packaging because of the emotions that it elicits, and the memories or the curiosity. So that's why we ended up doing this type of book, and the other books I've talked about, like Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto and The Beautiful Mess of Toronto Laneways.
When you started putting together the book, did you have a process for picking which things were included out of the tons of package designs that you had to choose from? Or I guess a follow-up to that question is, do you have a favorite artifact that was included in the book?
So part of it is my reaction to those products, right? It's like, how do I feel? Part of it was picking eras. Part of it was picking the type of, so there's a lot of food containers, but there wasn't a lot of things about booze, and so I want to make sure I had some stuff about booze. I want to make sure I had stuff about like home care and beauty and stuff like that. So it was difficult. I probably had about 400 or 500 objects photographed, and I think I ended up with about 200 objects in the book in total. So you got to be judicious. Some things are just end up on the cutting floor, the editing floor, so to speak. And so part of that is just about making sure you have a balance. Some of it is about making sure you tell a specific story about the part of the city or a culture or a community. Those things were very important to us too, so that while Toronto was a very white, waspy city up until World War II, it doesn't mean that it didn't have a diverse population. So we tried to reflect those things too. So part of it is being reflective of the time now, and the ideals that we as a magazine or as a city or a culture kind of hold dear, and look back and analyze a little bit of that as well.
Awesome. Speaking of our time now, as somebody who's taken a look at all of these package designs from the past, do you think that there's anything from present day that historians will look back on in 100 years and say, oh, this was representative of today's time, I guess?
Yeah, I think some of those things have become obsolete due to technology are probably one of the most interesting things. So we had one item in there that is like, even now you're like, really? It was like a light bulb heater. Basically, you would take a lamp, and where you put the light bulb in, it was like a heater. It was a coil that you would screw in there, and it would heat up. But because heaters are hot and they absorb a lot of electricity, lampshades were catching on fire. You would have shorting of the electrical outlet that the lamp was plugged into. Something like that is like really interesting because it's like I think it had a very kind of short lifespan as a product. In the same way that right now you look at those like nasal cleansers that you see like on those shopping channels or whatever like that, we're going to look back and go, really, that's what we were using at the time? So there's lots of items like that in the book that I find charming. So it's ones the technology has rendered obsolete that we're going to look back on and go, oh, that's really neat. And sometimes they're so inventive because they had to figure out things that we couldn't do. They didn't have, plastic molding the way that we do now. So things had to be made of like metal for the most part, or wood. And so that put a lot of limitations on things, but it also was very, very inventive. So there's some stuff that you look at that is totally gives you the idea that it's like a steampunk type of product, but it's not. It's actually it was from the 1920s, and it was made to curl your hair or something like that. But it's big and crazy and weird.
That's something that I found really charming about all of the packages, is that there was very little to no plastic in everything. It was all glass, wood, paper. I really loved that. Are there any other books that you would recommend to somebody who wants to learn more about package design or graphic design in relation to history, maybe?
Well, this is probably one of the things that is one of the important pieces of part of one of the important reasons for doing this book is that there is a gap in the history of design. So, we're very, both Toronto and Canadians, maybe people outside of Toronto don't think this, but we're not very chest thumping, right? We don't want to talk about the good things of our history, or we don't think we have as much history as other places do. But in fact, Toronto and Canada does. But when I went to do research on this topic, there's a very big gap in terms of the graphic design history of Canada or Toronto. Basically, there's very little exists pre World War II. They're always about a specific advertising or marketing company. It's their kind of corporate history, but it's never about. It hasn't been very much about the design itself. So, Todd Falkowski, who did a quote on the back of our book, it is the editor and publisher of the Canadian Design Resource, was so excited about our book specifically because it helps fill in this gap. It's not a deep history. We're not writing, 5,000 word essays, 10,000 word essays about this topic, but we're giving you glimpses. Think of it as like a snapshots into the history of the city and a period of the city, that if you really do want to get into it, you can dive a little bit more into. If you want to read about the history of ginger ale, what this book will do is give you an idea of kind of what happened and where it was headed, and then you can go off on your own and find a little bit more history about it. And that's kind of like the motivation of doing this book.
Very cool. And then pivoting a little bit, what does the future hold for you and for spacing? Is there anything exciting that you're looking forward to working on or dipping your toes in that you haven't already?
Well, yeah. So one is, I'm really excited. We're working on a website redevelopment of our magazine right now, and so readers in the next by the end of the year should be able to subscribe to a digital edition of our magazine. So I'm very excited about that. It's something that we've been kind of slow to do, but now we're kind of in a good spot to make it happen. From a book publishing point of view, is we actually have we at least have one more book coming this year. It'll be out in the fall, and it's called Souvenirs of Toronto Sports. And it's a very similar approach to Package Toronto, but it's with sports souvenirs that the city of Toronto has collected over the years. So it's the trophy from the 1920s that the best TTC hockey team. They're different branches, different garages, and they would play against each other. We have stuff from medals from the 1880s and 1890s. We have stuff from the city playgrounds from over 100 years ago that we're going to show. We have some amazing Toronto Maple Leaf, the hockey team memorabilia, some stuff from the Toronto Huskies, the predecessor to the Raptors in terms of a professional basketball in the city. We have some stuff about the Toronto Blizzard and the Toronto Croatia, which were the predecessors of professional football or professional soccer in Toronto. We have some stuff about the rise of women athletics, which kind of took place after the suffrage movement in the 1920s in Toronto. So this book is going to be interesting. We want to tell stories, very much like I was explaining earlier, stories about the city that aren't being told, that are kind of unique, and give you kind of a snapshot of the city in a place and time. And if you really want to dig into it, there potentially allows you to, as a point to start and kind of kick off your own little research about something.
Excellent. So we've got Package Toronto on sale this week. And then we also have 2 more books on sale. Could you maybe give us a little rundown of what those 2 books are about? Yeah.
So last summer we released Remnants of Mid-Century Toronto, which is a book about architecture in the city. It's not a best of. It's basically a collection of what's kind of left from the post-war building construction boom in our city. So lots of modernist and brutalist and ugly and beautiful buildings in this book, and we write about them because if you drive around Toronto, if you travel around the city, you might want to think about those Georgian and Victorian homes, but really we're a modern city. We're a post-war a city. We're 500,000 people in 1945, and now we're 2.5 million people. So our growth has come in that era, in that period. So that's what this book is. That's what that book is about, and it's a fantastic collection. It was done with Vic Pawa, who's a fantastic photographer, and then with a bunch of architects helping us write little tidbits of information about buildings and styles and architects. And then the other one is the book that I did, which is a straight up photography book. It's very little writing, mostly photography, and it's me documenting Toronto's laneways, specifically garages that are in a constant battle with nature. What I think about laneways in the city is that the front of our houses are what we look like when we go on a date, and our laneways, the back of our houses, are what we look like when we wake up the next morning from that date. It's not always beautiful. It's not always well kept, but it's honest, and in many ways, that's what our laneways kind of represent. They're a reflection of how we live in the city and how we used to live, because there's many laneways, garages that used to be workshops, that used to be stables, even for horses and for animals and stuff like that, and they were just in the middle of a neighborhood. And so that's what that book is about. I'm so charmed by laneways. If I could probably do anything, I'd probably just write about and photograph laneways for the rest of my life.
I love that. That's such a good analogy. It's so true about laneways. All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about, or something that you'd like to mention that you feel like you haven't gotten a chance to cover?
Well, Toronto, I would encourage anyone that's interested in the city to dive into our history. Our history is, not 200 and something years old. It's thousands of years old, with First Nations that have lived here. We've been making a real strong effort for the last couple of years to make sure we have pieces on Indigenous Toronto in every issue of our magazine, whether it's written or visual or mapping. So we're really excited about a large map that we're doing in this next issue, which is the potential for archaeological finds in the GTA, not just where things have been found, but where we think things can be found again. So I'm excited about making sure we continue to do that and give rise or give space to the voices of our First Nations and Indigenous people in the city and in our country. And it's really important for all of us, and especially for, like I said, going back to the history of the city. The history of Toronto is thousands of years old. So I encourage people to kind of dig into those histories and find out how actually interesting and important some of the places have been.
Excellent. Definitely agreed. Well, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with us today, Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great, and I wish everyone a happy summer, and hopefully we're out of this pandemic. If we're not already there, but I hope we're out of there really soon.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. All right, everyone, to check out more from Spacing and to get your copy of Package Toronto, go to spacing.ca. This has been today's WOTS Weekly Feature. Tune in on Thursday, where we'll be in conversation with Adam Bunch from Dundurn Press. For discounts and deals, including discounts on those 3 books that Matt mentioned today, check out toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca/weekly-features. From all of us at WOTS, happy reading.